What comes to mind when you think of modern ghost movies? There's a good chance you might think of this. Or maybe this. Or this. Or this. Or, heaven forbid, this. Okay, that was a cheap shot. Trashy's 90s Hill House remake aside, what do all of these films have in common? They're not very scary. Oh sure, many of them are well made, they're creative and feature cool designs and effects work, and they're undoubtedly very entertaining. But scary? Not so much. Let's just say they're not exactly subtle. Now, admittedly, much of this comes down to personal preference. I know a lot of people do find these movies scary, and that's cool, but I've just never found ghosts or demons to be particularly frightening, which, as a horror fan, has been frustrating because ghost movies are all the rage these days. Much like how the slasher genre rose to prominence in the 80s, ghosts and demonic spirit movies have become the go-to way for audiences to scare themselves, to the point where entire cinematic universes are being created out of them, with no sign of slowing down. But after watching Netflix's The Haunting of Hill House, I get it. I finally get it. Because now I realize that most modern ghost movies have been doing it all wrong. The Haunting of Hill House is loosely based on the 1959 novel of the same name by Shirley Jackson. Over 10 episodes, it tells the story of the Crane family across two timelines, one set in the past exploring their experiences living in Hill House, and the other set in the present day after a family tragedy forces them back together. At the center of the series is a mystery of the night that forced them to flee Hill House, a night that left their mother dead and forever scarred the 5 surviving children, who all live separate lives but are still haunted by their past. This series took me completely by surprise. At first, it appears to be another ghost story, the kind we see all the time, about families being haunted by malicious spirits that reside in their home. We've been telling ourselves this story over and over again, and at first glance, Hill House seems like that same kind of story, albeit well done from the very first frame. But as the series goes along, it quickly becomes apparent that the show has something else on its mind other than scaring you, which is something it does very well. Hill House got to me in ways no other movie or show of its kind ever has. I found it genuinely spooky, to the point where I even dreamed about it, and let me tell you, that almost never happens. This series got under my skin in a way most ghost stories, or really any horror stories, don't. And this got me thinking, what makes Hill House such an effective ghost story, one that actually gave me goosebumps and say out loud, okay, that was creepy, when so many other similar kinds of movies or shows failed? And it didn't take long for me to realize as I was watching it that it wasn't the actual ghosts, but more so how the ghosts are used in the context of the story and the meaning they carry to the characters. Now, it's no secret at this point that the show is actually an allegory for grief, trauma, depression, and mental illness. Much has been said about that already, so I'll try not to repeat what you may have heard too much, but I think this aspect of the series does need to be explored a bit because I think it's the core reason as to why The Haunting of Hill House is so chilling. First off, the show gets right what is probably the most important element of good horror, and that is character. While certainly important to all storytelling, it's doubly so for the horror genre, which as a form of storytelling exists to frighten the audience, to induce within them a sense of fear, anxiety, and dread, all the uncomfortable feelings we usually try to avoid. To this end, a good horror story allows us to explore these feelings in a safe, comfortable environment, either alone or with a group of like-minded people, and this is achieved by rooting the audience in a point of view they can empathize with. The greatest horror movies of all time do this. They are effective in scaring the audience because it gets them to care about the well-being of the characters. Conversely, bad horror movies aren't scary because they lack characters to care about, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, to be invested in the story. It's the difference between watching a character you care about walking down a dark and creepy hallway versus a bland, milquetoast, or flat-out unlikable character that you know exists merely to add to the body count. The former is filled with tension and suspense because you feel empathy for the character and want to see them unharmed, and it is through this shared connection that fear is generated. The latter is just boring because you know what's going to happen, and since you don't care about the character, you're just waiting for the inevitable. There is no tension, there is no suspense, and the only enjoyment comes from the self-aware twisted delight to be had in the spectacle of their death. The Haunting of Hill House has the advantage of being a 10-episode series, and thus is able to go real deep into its characters, getting you invested in them in a way your average average horror film, even the good ones, simply can't. In fact, Hill House spends its first half exploring the psyches of its characters, specifically the 5 Crane children, the story of which is mostly told from their point of view. There's Steve, the oldest, a struggling writer who found success writing about his family's experiences at Hill House. There's Shirley, who, along with her husband, owns and operates her own funeral home. There's Theo, the middle child, a child psychologist with extraordinary psychic abilities. And finally, there's the twins Nell and Luke, the youngest and most mentally scarred by what happened at the house. These characters are sympathetic, but also extremely flawed. Steve exploits his family for money. Shirley is a control freak who holds others to a higher standard than herself. Theo is emotionally distant. Luke is a drug addict, and Nell is depressed and anxious. These flaws are manifestations of the trauma they all experienced in the house. The death of their mother and the resulting loss of trust in their father splits the family apart, making them the definition of dysfunctional. All this is very compelling on its own. It's mostly well written, the actors all do a fantastic job bringing the characters to life, and the skillful direction emphasizes the drama in such a way that efficiently draws you in. It's not long before you become really wrapped up in this family and their interpersonal relationships. It feels real and relatable. It's human in a really raw way. So what happens when you throw in a haunted house and a bunch of creepy ghosts into all this drama? Well, you get some truly effective horror, the kind that sticks with you long after you stop watching. This is not to say, however, that the show isn't lacking in your typical horror tropes. Jump scares, creepy basements, and sinister thunderstorms abound throughout. But as with any trope, when it's executed well, it doesn't really matter. And in the case of Hill House, they are well executed, tasty morsels sprinkled on top of an engaging story of a family torn apart and brought back together by grief, which as a psychological concept lies at the very heart of what draws us to the idea of ghosts. Humans have been convinced they've been seeing ghosts ever since we've been aware of the concept of death. They speak to us in a very primordial way. Hell, I was convinced I saw the ghost of a dead loved one when I was a kid, when I was still raw from the emotion of the loss. Whether real or imagined, ghosts are universal to the human experience. They are both manifestations of our longing to see those who have left us behind and our fear of what lies beyond death. It's why in the year 2018, despite being surrounded by technology that has seemingly disproven their existence, ghosts continue to fascinate so many people. As long as we continue to lack any sort of understanding about what happens to us after we die, many people, whether out of fear or comfort, will be convinced that ghosts exist. The Haunting of Hill House approaches its ghosts this way, reining back the bombast and over-the-top nature typical of the genre nowadays in favor of a more nuanced, old-school approach that emphasizes ambiguity and the unknown, and generates fear through stillness, solitude, and a creeping sense of inescapable dread. Though ghosts aren't shown to be explicitly evil. In fact, they are presented as tragic beings. They hover around the characters, watching them from afar. They aren't out to necessarily do them harm. They are merely victims that haunt those that continue to live, trapped between life and death. This is so much more subtly frightening than a demonic nun or possessed doll ever could be, because it speaks to a universal fear of isolation and emotional longing. It speaks to the sadness inherent to ghosts that truly makes them scary. And so by attaching all this doom and gloom to a cast of great characters, it becomes, well, for lack of a better word, haunting in a very personal and relatable way. All of the characters have their own ghosts, psychological and emotional issues resulting from a trauma they haven't recovered from, even if on the surface they have. The ghosts, while creepy in their own right, are more so because they represent real-world issues, mental scars we carry around with us day by day. This makes the series incredibly sad, which amplifies the horror. There's a profound sense of melancholy on display here that I haven't felt from a work of fiction in a really long time. The intense emotions felt after the sudden death of a loved one are captured incredibly well, and for as many moments that spooked me, there were moments that moved me, sometimes both at the same time. Sorrow and fear are two sides of the same coin, and Hill House bounces between these emotions seamlessly, creating a unique blend of horror and drama that chilled me to the bone. Perhaps this is why the ending didn't bother me too much, though I can see where those that dislike it are coming from. By the time the final moments began playing out on screen, I was well aware of the message the series was trying to convey. If The Haunting is really about the effects of trauma on people, then Hill House itself is a metaphor for our universal longing to stay safe and avoid suffering, which is inevitable and inherent to life itself. The house preys on that fear of how painful life on the outside can be, and how tempting it is to recluse oneself and to shut others out to avoid this pain. It uses these feelings to draw people in, giving them what they want, to seduce them into staying forever. However, the show argues that living, no matter how scary and painful it can and will be, it is necessary and better than rotting in self-induced purgatory. Sure, there is no pain, but there is also no joy joy. And while life can be painful and full of suffering, you can make it less so if you make an earnest effort to connect with others. Only unconditional love can save us from the unquenchable hunger of the outside world and the trauma it inflicts on us. It's pretty schmaltzy, to be sure, but an effective message no less. And another way in which The Haunting of Hill House isn't content with being standard horror. It avoids a cliche of the genre, where it appears the characters make it out only for evil to follow in the end. Sure, it could be argued that it trades one cliche for another, and there is a bit of mixed messaging going on, but within the horror genre, an uplifting ending that inspires hope and rewards the characters for their trials is a rare thing, and whether you agree with the choice or not, it makes the series more interesting than had it ended with a more traditional dark twist. The Haunting of Hill House is some of the best horror storytelling I've ever seen, and it is because all the terror, the grotesqueries, the horrific imagery, the ghosts and ghouls, all exist in service to the characters and the greater theme of the story. At its heart, it's about how scary life itself is, how death impacts us and informs who we become, and how we can move on from trauma by embracing those along the path. It's a generational story, with ghosts as the manifestations of all the characters' fears and insecurities, and it is because of all this that it is scarier than almost any other horror movie out there. I dare say it just might be a near masterpiece, and I think a lot of modern horror can learn a thing or two from it, because when the things that go bump in the night actually have meaning to them, when they speak to the real horrors of the world, they become that much more frightening.